Central bankers and politicians have been absolutely gaslighting Americans for months now. If we go back 18 months ago or so, in March of 2020, there was absolute hysteria. This thing called COVID was taking over, and governments were stepping in and forcing their citizens to lock down, saying go home and do not come out of your home. It's for public health reasons. Of course, when that occurred, all of a sudden, investors in financial markets got very, very scared. There was uncertainty. There was fear. So what did? They sold off every single asset they had that had a liquid market attached to it. There was a liquidity crisis, and they wanted dollars. Gold went down 15%, stocks went down 25%, and Bitcoin went down 50%, all in a very short number of days in March of 2020. As soon as that occurred, just as in 2008, global financial crisis, the government and central banks stepped in with absolute monetary and fiscal policy bazookas. They lowered 2 emergency interest rate cuts all the way down to a zero-rate environment. And there was trillions of dollars of monetary and fiscal stimulus that was injected into the economy in every exotic corner they could find. They were literally dropping helicopter money on people. They were giving out unemployment booster benefits. And on top of that, they were buying so many bonds that they literally got tired of it. Now, when this was all occurring, the storyline was, don't worry about inflation. Inflation isn't going to happen. There's a deflationary macro force here. Do not worry. Inflation is not something that we're concerned about. And then towards the end of 2020, they started to talk about, well, we still don't think inflation is here, but maybe it could happen. And then in the beginning of 2021, into April or May and even June of 2021, people started saying, wait a second, isn't inflation happening? We're seeing more than 2% inflation. What's going on? And then they started to talk about and say at central bank level, that's because we want it. We want there to be over 2% inflation for some period of time. But then by the time we got to July, and August, September, and October, we started to see 5+% CPI numbers and then 6% CPI numbers. And then we saw President Biden, his new administration, go ahead and raise their inflation target from 2% in Q4 of 2021 to 4.8%. They more than 2.5x'd their own inflation expectations. The entire time you were told, do not worry about it. This is transitory. It's transitory and it's transitory. Well, now today, Jerome Powell is on the stand. He is talking about this. He's being asked questions by politicians. We got a couple of comments that he made that are quite interesting. Remember, it's transitory. Don't worry about it. Inflation is not here to stay. The first one is that Jerome Powell started out and he admitted that there is a higher risk of higher inflation. It's exactly what Bitcoiners have been warning about the entire time. Bitcoiners were screaming and yelling, saying you cannot print trillions and trillions of dollars and not have adverse effects. But Jerome Powell now saying, wait a second, even though we have 6.2% CPI, there is a risk of higher inflation, and that risk is increasing. So rather than it being transitory, rather than it tapering off, instead what we're seeing is the potential to accelerate inflation. If the official numbers are saying 6.2%, the unofficial numbers are showing over 10%. Pretty scary stuff. But he wasn't done yet. He had more stuff to say. The second tweet that we have here was inflation was never transitory. Nobody who understands economics actually thought it was transitory. It was all a game. They were just gaslighting you. You can't create trillions of dollars of liquidity and not have adverse side effects. But now they are being forced to admit it. You can only say it's transitory for so long. And as we have talked about over and over and over again on this show, transitory was a very specific word that was used because it's not measurable. What is transitory? Is it days? Is it weeks? Is it months? Is it years? Nobody knows. At what point do we hit transitory? At what point do we come off of transitory? Nobody knows. It is not a quantifiable metric, and that's the whole point, is that you can move the goalpost without ever anybody noticing. Except for we have the internet, and we have social media, and there's people who can think for themselves, the independent thinkers, those who come from a first principle standpoint, those who understand Austrian economics, kept calling nonsense. They said, this is not possible. What you're talking about makes no sense. I don't care what textbook you read. I don't care what college professor you talked to or what economics expert you brought in to give you a $200,000 talk. You're wrong. And now we're seeing the market determine the same thing because the Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell, today suggested that we stop using the word transitory. It's a big deal. No longer do they want to use the word transitory when speaking about inflation. He said, quote, I think it's probably a good time to retire that word and try to explain more clearly what we mean. It was never transitory. They knew that. I knew that. Everyone knew that. They simply are just gaslighting now. They told you not to worry about it. Then they told you their goal was a little bit over 2%. Then they told you that it was transitory. Now they're telling you it's good for you. Maybe we should stop listening to them. Maybe we should actually start just looking at the data ourselves and realizing that the official numbers are wrong. But even if you give them the benefit of the doubt and say that the official numbers are right, They're even having to admit now it was never transitory. Inflation is here. It's here to stay. It's likely to get worse. And if you don't understand how inflation works, if you don't understand what the relationship to money is, if you're saving, you're losing. Savers are losers in this economy. The advice that your grandparents or your parents gave you about spend less than you make and just put it all in cash in the bank, and one day you'll save enough and then you'll become rich. They were right for their generation. Today's environment, you can't do that because quite literally your cash is losing 6% every single year. It's the only investment in the world I know where you're guaranteed to lose value and people still rush in and hold it. How big of a deal is it that he wants to retire the word transitory and he doesn't want to use that anymore?
Makes me nervous that they knew everything that was going on the entire time and they didn't tell people about it. It's clearly not transitory. It never was transitory. I believe that they knew personally that it wasn't, but they had to kind of put on the face for the American people. Powell knows what creates inflation, and printing trillions and trillions of dollars does not help. And they can't stop. They're going to have to continue to print money.
So I just for some fun here, I Googled transitory just to get the official definition. It says it is temporary or not permanent. And the point why that's important is because they use that word for a reason, right? You can't hold them to a time period when you say that word. It could have been a month, it could have been 6 months, it could have been a year, maybe even 2 years. Who knows, right? You can make an argument that transitory can mean any amount of time that's possible. So that word was used on purpose because it didn't hold them to a time period. Great, got it. But when you look at the Federal Reserve, how do they get this wrong, right? Like you either intentionally misled people by lying to them and telling them that you thought it was transitory and you thought it was going to go away, or you missed it, right? And it's hard to believe that they missed it because people on Twitter, Bitcoiners, were literally yelling for months nonstop saying inflation is coming. You guys introduced 40% of the money supply has been introduced or printed within the last 12 to 24 months. Inflation is coming. Yeah, I looked it up earlier. The Federal Reserve has 23,000 employees and they own over $3 billion worth of real estate in this country. That's how big they are. It's massive. It's massive. And you're telling me that they didn't know that the money printing that they were doing was going to lead to seriously higher prices and the loss of purchasing power for millions of Americans? I don't buy it. And the only other logical explanation is that they lied about it.
John, when you start to look at this, do you think that there's another word that is better to use for it? Or do you think that now they're just going to say inflation is here?
Insane. Like out of control. There's a million different things, but transitory is just not the word. I'm looking at the Fed balance sheet now. It's almost $9 trillion. I think we might get there by the end of the year if they keep printing money and they pass more and more bills. But yeah, no, transitory is just not the word to use here. I'd have to sit down. I'm sure they sat down and had kind of brainstorming sessions about what do we tell people? Do we tell them that we expect it really high? Like, how do we basically phrase it in a manner that wouldn't panic people, but would get the message across? And I think they missed the mark on this one.
The big thing that I think is important to call out. So just now, Josh Wolf, who is a venture investor at Lux Capital, he just tweeted out a screenshot of a Financial Times article, which, by the way, the people who write at the Financial Times, they've turned that thing into TMZ of the financial. The Financial Times is an absolute shit show, and I don't care if you work there or not. It's a complete shit show. If you work there, please quit. Like, just go. Please go to another publication that is better. But the thing that Josh Wolf has said is he said, be warned, an entire generation, a growing percent that are quitting their jobs in day trading, stocks, or crypto, has not seen a downturn. A graduate of college in 2019, now age 35, has seen nothing but up markets. And I think there's two things about this. One, not true, right? Literally, they lived through a recession last year. So there was a recession last year that everyone lived through. Second is that I responded. I said, bear markets have been outlawed by politicians and central bankers. The market is manipulated, and it is literally impossible for the market to go down when they are willing to intervene with monetary and fiscal stimulus every time we get a few days of prices falling. And I think that's a key piece to this whole thing is that we don't live in a free market. The free market is literally being manipulated and intervened in every single time that we even come close to having a week of down prices. We have to have all-time highs over and over and over again, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the funniest part when people claim that Bitcoin is manipulated, right? It's the most honest market we have, and plenty of people have said that in the past, but it's true. And the reality is, right, like what happens in an economy? Not only do they print cash, they can stimulate, they can buy bonds, they can do all these things, mess with mortgages, they can do a million different things, right? They'll halt trading if a stock isn't going their way. The rules are not fair for everyone, and they can manipulate the market at their own will. Bitcoin is completely the opposite. It's a 24/7 market. It's decentralized. It trades freely, openly, etc. It is the most honest market there is. And no one is manipulating it like the Federal Reserve is with the infusion of cash and all this stuff. So I think when you talk about politicians and people that are saying these outrageous things, they need to be called out on this stuff, because what it comes down to is that the market that we have here, the stock market, the equity market here in the United States, is way more manipulated by the Federal Reserve and others than the Bitcoin market is.
I agree with that, but do you think that Bitcoin is a beneficiary of it, or do you think that Bitcoin is the leader of it? Like, is Bitcoin being advantageous or like capturing the value of what they're doing, just like every other asset, or is Bitcoin actually the one that's kind of leading it, and then they're reacting to things that are happening in the free market, the honest market?
Wait, so you're asking basically if Bitcoin is benefiting from them manipulating the other market?
Yeah, like basically Bitcoin can serve as either, all asset prices are going up and Bitcoin just benefits, or Bitcoin is outside of the system and people are running to Bitcoin because they believe that they're going to manipulate the market. So Bitcoin is the leading indicator. Like is Bitcoin following the actions, or is Bitcoin the leading indicator?
Well, I think one of the things to think about too is just the amount of money that was injected into the system, right? And Bitcoin, we all talk about this all the time, right? Like there is a constrained amount of supply. And when you have that fixed supply or constrained supply, and we know exactly how much is out there, when you inject all this money, you print all this money, and then everyone gets scared of inflation, what do? Not only do they have more money to go invest in things, but they're all looking for an inflation hedge. And I think that's why we've seen the stock market has obviously benefited a lot over the year from that also, but Bitcoin has benefited tremendously. And that's the argument between Bitcoin and gold, right? Because gold would typically be that inflation hedged asset, but it hasn't been over the past year. It's actually down or even for the last year. And Bitcoin has benefited tremendously, I think, from that money printing and people saying, hey, look, this is a much more fair and honest market than the stock market probably is.
Yeah. And people forget there was a recession literally 18 months ago.
Yeah.
Like
a 2-month recession.
And it was over just
but
that.
again,
It was
there was still a recession.
Right? Yeah,
there was still a recession. Literally.
But why did it end so quickly? Because they
stepped in and intervened and went nuts. And so literally when you say things like an entire generation has not seen a downturn, like they literally saw stocks fall 25% in a couple of days. And on top of that, it was qualified as a recession. There was 14 million Americans that lost their jobs, or I'm sorry, 14% unemployment rate. There was 6 million people a week that was filing for first-time unemployment claims for multiple weeks in a row. Literally their businesses were shut down. People thought we were going into the Great Depression until they stepped in.
Now we have people quitting their jobs.
Crazy, absolute craziness.